constantly in trouble.
I'd like to call to order the June 8th meeting of the Isle of Palms Planning Commission and note that the public and press were notified in accordance with state law. First on the agenda, we've got a new Planning Commission member, Dr. Jeffrey Rubin. I hate to dispense with pleasantries, but why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Great way to get involved in this group.
Okay, well,
And welcome.
I'm a retired surgeon. Moved to bought some property in Isle of Palms in the early 90s and was living in Cleveland and Michigan after that, and moved down full time about 4 years ago, and as academic physician. Not much. I've got 3 kids and 5 grandchildren, and that's a wife who understands me, and a dog who manipulates me.
That's right. Thank you.
So, welcome.
Yes, welcome. Welcome to the group.
Jeffrey knows my mom.
Oh, boy.
So
Very
be nice
well.
to me.
Oh, okay.
The next order, we had some, our previous vice chairman had taken a demotion to city council. And
Anyways,
and so we're without a vice chair person, and would be happy to accept any nominations.
I want to nominate Marty.
Second that. For Marty. Good thing you were at least here. Do we have any other nominations? Let's take it to a vote. All those in favor of Marty as our new vice chair, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All even assented. So we've got a vice chair. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Marty.
That's right.
Tell it.
Okay, so next up on the agenda is the review and approval of the minutes from our last meeting on May 11. Do we have any motions?
Move to accept as written.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? There being none, let's vote. Those in favor of accepting the minutes as written signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Again, unanimous. Our new business agenda item is the discussing of short-term rental recommendations of implementing a cap. And Douglas, I would be more than happy, unless it's Matt's turn.
I'm going to spare Matt for about
Okay.
30 more days.
All right.
Yeah, so when we left last time, you all had a draft recommendation at that meeting. There were some modifications that we discussed. Primarily that we had on our end, we changed the map slightly. We created, I think there were 9 zones. We've gone now to 3 zones plus an uncapped area. We had a little bit of dialogue between the staff and Steve and David about specifically the Wildwood subdivision. You'll recall that was tied to a zone that was connected to the area between 42nd, 57th. We initially put them into the section connected to Wild Dunes. We revised that after our discussions and put them in with the zone 2, which is connected to the area between 21st and 41st. At the last draft, the number of rental properties included in the cap was the 2020 numbers plus 20%. This group recommended to reduce that down to 10%. So the numbers are different in this version than last month's version. And then the other change was the transferability. And just for the benefit of you all and those that might be watching, in the packet, the issue on transferability had the licenses not transferring. This group agreed last month that they would transfer. So the most recent version you have has the licenses transferring upon the sale of a property. So those are the changes in the packet from last month, kind of the path forward that we've been discussing and want to get kind of finalized tonight. We had hoped that the group, that this would be at a point that the group feels comfortable making a recommendation. If that's the case, we had discussed having a workshop with city council to kind of hand off all of the information, the data and the recommendation to city council. And then at that point, it would go through the process of being codified through council. So that's kind of where we are. Had a little bit of further analysis of various details of it that we can get into if the group wants to, but that's kind of high level. That's where we are today. Be happy to answer questions or discuss whatever points you all may have. Steve?
Yeah, I know that fairly well represents what we talked about last meeting. But as you know, as with everything, when things get to settle in for a month or so, there's some other issues that at least came to my mind. As I said, when the zones were created, and quite honestly, I'm the one that originally drew the map, really just to sort data by. I'm not so sure I had envisioned it, and I said this last meeting, as being zones that would be regulated that way. That being said, that's where we came to. My concern is more the uncapped zone. Right now, if you look at the three zones that are laid out, 1, 2, and 3, that's round number, I don't have the exact number, 2,700 properties. The uncapped zone has about 1,900 properties, and those are somewhere around, there's about 50% licenses in those. So that means we're really allowing for almost 800 more licenses to appear in those zones if that's the worst case scenario. And I question whether that's what we're trying to accomplish here. By not having caps in those, like I said, there could be another 700, 800 licenses. And I just want to raise that for discussion.
That's a good point that you make, though, because I mean, that's a large number.
It's a tremendous
So,
number.
So how would you delineate? And my mind immediately goes to Wildwood, the condominiums. So there, how many ever licenses and how many ever potentially not licensed? And what are they doing with those properties? How do you identify what they're doing? And how does putting a cap on those, whoever they are and what they're doing, fix any of the issues that we're trying to fix? Quality of life, traffic, safe environment. Does it?
I'm sorry.
The question comes to my mind is, does putting a cap on the condominiums that were all built for that utility of in and out, family usage, second homes, rental? What are we doing long term to them by capping it?
Yeah, and also, I understand. I agree. Some of these facilities were built for that purpose.
Just thinking out loud.
Absolutely. But also after 10 or 12 years of this, to some degree, the market has determined where the licenses are. Okay.
Yep.
And by us starting to not arbitrarily, but to us to try to manage the lines, I just question whether we're getting too much into the weeds. You know, if the reason there's more licenses on Ocean Palm and the condos is because people want to be on the beach. So by us saying we're going to artificially or impose numbers on other areas of the island to keep people from going there, well, they haven't been going there because they come down and want to go to the beach. There's a different rental market or desire to be on on Seagrass Lane or Forest Trail or Sparrow than there is to be beachfront condos. So after 12 years, I could argue that the market has kind of determined where the licenses are. Now, there may be some individual variations, and as we've seen in some of the areas, yeah, they're plus or minus 10% here and there. It may vary year to year. But by us saying we're going to restrict the licenses here, in some ways it's going to drive licenses to other places. If people really want to come down, they're going to say, okay, well, the only place I can get a license now is in the unrestricted area. So I guess I'm going to have to buy a place there. And so I'm just concerned that we're creating a dynamic that forces licenses into one area and that's not, I'm not sure that's what we want to be doing. And especially as I go back to say, I think the market has determined where the licenses are at this point. And yes, there may be some fluctuation over time, but that's my answer. What's going on in the condos is because that's what's happening. Some people buy them for families, some people buy them for rentals, very few people buy them to live, but a few people buy them to live. But I don't think changing the structure of the licenses is going to change that dynamic.
For 30 and in some cases 40 years, many of these complexes have been there and been what we're seeing today with the similar numbers. It, again, to your point, the market has kind of fleshed out what it's going to do. Are we artificially pushing people out of Forest Trail at, let's use a $500,000 price to a condo on the front beach for $1 million? I'm not sure that's the way to think. But I hear what you're saying. There may be some transition at that level. But again, I've kind of looked back in history, 30 or 40 years of history, the condos are kind of the same rental numbers that we've watched and seen.
But again, taking that to the next level, rather than creating these zones, if you just had an overall cap on the island, it would continue to follow the trends that it's had for 30 or 40 years, most likely. And therefore, it wouldn't be forcing people to make that decision. We're saying, gee, I really want to buy a place down there as a placeholder for my ultimate retirement home or whatever. I'm going to rent in the interim. But golly, gee, I can't get a license on Carolina Boulevard, but I can on Palm. That might affect their decision on where they have to buy.
Well, some of the reason why we started this was to push or keep or tame or herd,
Well, big words.
a lot of the vacationers from infiltrating the inner part of the island, so you can maintain the quality of life and livability. But this whole non-cap zone, if you look at it too, is composed of like multi-different multi-areas. You have single-family units, you have high-density units with the condos, and even higher built upon when you look at downtown. So I mean, what we have for the no cap zone kind of consists of a lot of different types of residents.
So to kind of build on that comment and to better dig into your comment, Steve, would you, and I guess Sandy is also hitting on this, if a building, seascape built in Wild Dunes, if theoretically that property, that zone, if we decided to apply a cap to seascape, do we care? I mean, would we care if seascape went 100% rental? I think it probably has always been that way. It would almost seem functionally that it was built that way and almost has to be that way. So I guess in my mind, I could see where those type structures that were built, used historically, and probably will forever be 100% used for rentals, that maybe the cap doesn't apply to those. But then when you get into this mixture of, single family homes on Ocean Boulevard, to single family homes, Palm Boulevard between 21st and 41st, single family homes, and does that kind of split the difference between what we've currently are looking at, where we have uncapped zones? Maybe we back that down to apply caps to the residential portions that currently are in our maps as uncapped. Would that get to where?
And I think those are all subtleties that can be looked at. but also if you presented the argument that said, okay, if you had an overall cap of 1,500 for the island, it would end up being distributed very much the same way in all likelihood, because that's what the last 12 years has shown us. So do we really need to develop sub areas and saying, okay, there's going to be different caps in different areas, or do we say that the number is 14, 16 now, it's been as high as 1,500. It's okay, the cap is 1,500 across the whole island, and you're going to see the same distribution. The short-term rentals are going to congregate closer to the beach. That's just kind of the way it's been.
So just in the kind of ninth hour in the last day or so, and we've just sent an email to this effect. I do think the data is showing that what we're now calling zone 2, which is the area between 21st and 41st, back from Palm Boulevard, in my mind, has seen a significant increase in the last 2 years. I think that the numbers were about 135 2 years ago. They're, as of today, 165. Percentage wise, it's a 20% increase in 2 years. And kind of even more puzzling, I guess would be the right word. Of those 165, I think it's 78 are brand new, were not rented just 2 years ago. So 78 new rentals in that one area, which in my mind is the area that has kind of created the majority of the stir. I don't think that we hear from people in commercial buildings that or condos that say, hey, I have a new rental next to me. I think they just accept it. But I think the data is showing us that in those back sides of the island, the number, at least in zone 2, is going up at a clip, a pretty sharp clip, and an overall island cap wouldn't get at that. It would allow that migration. And
Well, ultimately, the number would be capped out and they would have to be sacrificed from somewhere else. If you had a 1,500 cap and you hit 1,500 and someone wanted to put a new place in zone 2, they'd have to go on the waiting list just like everybody else. So ultimately, like I said, I'm not saying that you don't have a cap. But I'm not, like I said, I'm just discussing. Yeah, I agree. I think zone 2 is, the data shows, has been the most in transition, clearly. And there's been a lot of in and out, and arguably 20 or 30 over 2 years is, I don't know, if you got a statistician, they might tell you that's not that significant, but it's a real number. So I mean, I think an overall cap would still address that and say, okay, if we're at 1,500, if another 20 or 30 ended up in zone 2, we would reach the cap and would be done. So an overall cap can accomplish the same thing.
but we're seeing at the same time in Wild Dunes, the residential area, that number has gone down by 80. So did we just allow the migration of 80 out of zone 3 and into zone 2? And is that a better program than having kept zone 2 kind of at the current numbers, 2020 numbers? You're cutting off that migration that may happen as prices ebb and flow in different areas.
So then do we focus on occupancies on these homes? I mean,
Well, that's a can of worm we don't have the data to address right now. It's taken us a year to get our hands around the short-term rental licenses.
I
much less
know, but-
bedrooms and occupancy.
but
So
it all is in this package as well. I mean, that could be an area that,
the occupancy, well, the number of bedrooms is only a one snapshot picture out from the
True.
county database at 1 year.
true.
So opening up the occupancy, I think long-term, they all need to be looked at. Don't get me wrong. I think this is the beginning of better managing the data,
Well,
but we don't have all that data right now.
I'm sorry, I don't have this right in front of me of how many bedrooms, like 610 Ocean. They advertise, sleeps 28, which is a little outrageous. I don't know where they would park those cars. So, I mean,
They have a limit. And the city governs that.
Right.
It's been in place
hope.
since 2010.
Right.
Our house has been there for how many years? The K's built that. added
Oh,
on to
Curtis,
it.
yeah.
The
I think
laws
that is
changed, the zoning changed. I mean, they got.
We didn't add, we renovated it
That's
after a
right.
fire.
Remodeled.
Move the wall.
So,
more.
Douglas, I didn't mean to open a tremendous can of worms. I realized I opened one at the 11th hour here to some degree. And I think my concern or my issue was a little less the zone 1, 2, 3 and some individual caps. So I could argue that there maybe don't need that. But the uncapped is really what I was more getting at and saying to have that large a portion of the island uncapped when ultimately we're trying to manage
Brain
the hubbub and the clutter and still leave that for another potential 800 or 1,000 licenses just seems like a big gap in what we're putting together here.
It would seem, it seemed that the no cap would work well in the multifamily situation. And by multifamily, more than just the 2 or 3 duplexes, triplexes that might be outside of the commercial area. I mean, a condo, 1 or 2 bedrooms, is generally not going to have 24 people staying in them like you might get in one of the other vacation rental homes. And that's really where the issue and the problem is. So, you know, if we reformulated the map, the no cap zone really becomes the condos, front beach, where a condo hotel, where do you call that? I mean, it's intended to be a hotel.
Right.
And then, you know, square that away with the rest of Palm Boulevard or the avenues, you know, unlimiting the 50s, it seems kind of counterproductive because those are still relatively neighborhoodly
Right.
neighborhoods. And I don't know if you in a sense jinx them to being taken over, and which is exactly what we really don't want to have happen. That was one of the people who wrote a letter about the non-transference of business license was afraid, as we had spoke last month, that it could create a migration.
Right.
Which is happening in zone 2 too. The migration is also moving towards the back end of the island, which is counterintuitive to what we were thinking with things staying kind of oceanside.
And I think it's the market conditions that are causing that, because it's the affordability and the return on that investment that works.
Right.
In a lesser price property versus the front beach. I don't see a migration out of zone 2 into condominiums. And so what is the potential for the condominiums that are unlicensed to the equation you're speaking to? How many of the 800 that you're alluding to actually are condominiums that don't have licenses now that in some shape, fashion, or form are actually being utilized, just not a rental?
Mhm.
To some extent, yes, do we
A
care?
little over half of those have licenses now, so it's got 300 or 400 that still don't have licenses. And I agree. I do put the condos, townhouses, and villas into a little different bucket. That's why most of them were built. That's why they're structured. But as Ron just pointed out, the 50 streets and the other residential on Ocean and Palm, are we forcing those to become 100% licensed if we go this route? The condos, I agree with you completely. The villas, the condos, there's still a lot of them, but that's why they were built.
Well, what about this? Does anybody think that we're gonna get this right on this first cut? I mean,
No, this is a big challenge. here.
not that we're striving to lose here, but you know, back to the impetus of this in the beginning, it was livability concerns primarily in zone 2. And I think by delineating, we've begun to address that.
Yeah.
So what's wrong with the take it as it comes approach? And if we start this system, if we begin to get livability concerns in the unrestricted zones, then we can relook at that.
We've always, at least last meeting, we spoke quite a bit to the point that this will be revisited at some point a year from now. There's no, Marty, to your point, if there's no issue, that it may not be revisited for 2 or 3 or 5 years, but I expect it'll be revisited. If history serves me correctly, we've revisited it quite regularly.
I was going to, say, digging through when we kind of got rid of like the Ocean and Palm Boulevard zones that we originally started with. I can agree with you that I think we should be looking at them, but historically, at least from when I was digging through the data, we're actually seeing on those zones that they're becoming more residential, not what we all expected, that that's becoming more short-term rentals on those two streets. So that's part of why I had really no objections in this round of letting them just go as is for the, next year or two or however long until we see a problem. But that was kind of surprising to me, especially on Ocean Boulevard. And again, it's only a handful that we're shifting from front beach to back. Now, when we cap the back, will they start shifting back to the front? That gets back more to, the demand for residential beachfront versus the demand for vacation. I think whatever we do is going to have an effect on that market. But I'm not sure which way it's going to go.
It almost seems as though the economics of the cost of Ocean Boulevard and Ocean Front on Palm Boulevard has kind of created a cap in and of itself, because you can't really afford to purchase it and make it a rental. I mean, some people obviously can, but that's,
yeah.
the economics are, it's not as easy economically to do it as it would be
Right,
elsewhere. So
and I
it's-
don't, again, we've seen comments about how will this affect the economics is, we know kind of from, there's more and more demand for rentals on the island right now. And when you cap the supply that's available, it's going to, people will be willing to pay more to rent a house, and eventually we hit a turning point where it changes the other direction. I don't know. I mean, that's something we'll have to kind of watch. But
So the other, and maybe I just thought about this while you all were discussing it last month. I felt like there was a desire to kind of, and I would just kind of say legislate with a scalpel instead of a hatchet, in terms of the ability for something like this to survive, make it as dialed back as you could get approved at this level. And that if you were to, and I don't know what the outcry would be if you did go forward with a recommendation to cap all of it, or to cap additional neighborhoods that are more highly rentals historically. I don't know. I don't know what that does to impact the ability of getting something done, if it negatively impacts that or not. But that was kind of a takeaway of mine personally, of the thought behind having large parts being uncapped. I don't just bring that up for point of reference.
So you sleep well at night.
Yep, it makes me sleep at night.
I think we've done some good work here. To Steve's point, all the island could go vacation rental. Everything, if we don't put a cap on it. And I think we've taken a really good approach to what we have concluded with what we have and what we are working with the caps that we have in the 3 zones that we have. And the uncapped area currently, historically, I think that the market has really taken care of it. We have seen a decrease in vacation rentals over the last arguably 18 months. There's some factors out there, and I fully expect to see either a flattening or a further decrease. And again, because of the market prices, the conditions that I've constantly been talking about, doesn't make economic sense. While there may be demand and the prices of those vacation rentals will come up, I think that the prices again will reflect that return on investment also.
yeah,
It's not going to sit still. I think the two kind of go hand in hand. So I don't have any data to go one way or the other with, we need to cap or don't, for what historically is kind of bad. And I do like what we've done with the Carolina, Forest Trail, and the Wild Dunes residential communities. I think we've answered a lot of folks' concerns and addressed them. And again, I go back to a year from now, we revisit it, see what's popping up that we may have missed. I think we've been fairly thorough in our deliberations on this.
So a couple paths forward that I would say. One is if there is an appetite for putting a cap on what we are currently showing as uncapped. I think I would suggest from hearing you all talk that it only applied to the single-family residential properties. And that be a recommendation. We could go back, develop a different map, create new zones, do that, push it forward. That would be one path forward. Another path forward is to keep the recommendation as you currently have it, knowing that you're going to have this workshop with city council. You can explain the thought, the logic behind the way it is currently, but just say, we've had long and hard conversations with it, kind of, and I don't know if you're split or not on it, but explain it as a point for them to further consider. I mean, they're obviously going to have their own lens that they see this through. So that's kind of a second path forward, is leave it as is, but explain and, as you're handing it off, the need to look at it and consider this other point separately. And I guess the other option would be just leave it as it is and go forward with it.
I like the second. I think that having that workshop is going to be priceless.
Yeah, I mean, we all are guilty of, we get into it and we look at it under our own microscope for months. And, they will look at it with completely different perspectives and points of view. Steve, you brought it up. What's your feeling on it?
The reality is, no matter what we decide, it's ultimately council's decision. So I
Right.
think having a workshop and talking to them and expressing some of the issues. And like I said, I go back to, I don't, my first comments were not that I'm opposed to what we've done so far, 1, 2, and 3. I'm just raising the additional concern of some of the uncapped. And I think that's worthy of discussion and probably with council and workshop. But
So
1, 2,
may-
and 3,
It could be handled with just limiting the single family residential.
that may be a simple solution.
So maybe we, now that we've kind of gotten our handle, our hands around the numbers, the mapping, the zones, maybe we analyze those. I would say they're kind of 3 zones: Ocean Boulevard, Palm,
In the 50s.
and I guess I see it in my mind, I'm seeing Palm between 21st and 41st as one zone, and then from 41st to 57th as a third zone. And we just have that data ready. And I think to Sandy's point, explain that, we have a watchful eye on it. Within a year, we will take another look at it to just see if there's something that we're seeing that's alarming. And just kind of make a commitment to look at it in a year from now, especially after, I guess I'm assuming that the cap comes to pass. Maybe we'll see some of that shifting already within a year. So maybe that's a workable path forward.
And I'm sorry, I keep asking this question. What is the licensure period? Renewal is
End of April.
end of April.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll know pretty soon here, next 2023, what's going on at the end of April.
Yeah. And so just for the benefit of the group, we had this kind of natural ending of April where we had a lot of renewals come in. Since the beginning of May and today, it kind of stopped. And I guess as the rumor mill starts churning, it's now in the last week, we're starting to get 10 a day or so of people trying to protect themselves, I think, and getting in kind of before a cap is implemented. So our ordinance as it's written, I think kind of addresses that in terms of you have to have been actively renting it. So some of those I think would come off. But I do think with the numbers as we currently have them written, well, I know that the number of rentals in zone 2 today already exceeds the cap. So we would be faced with the question at the time that they ratify, or assuming the council ratifies the code, how to deal with that. You know, do you move the cap to the day, to the number that day, or do you have a waiting list day one of the cap being implemented? So we'll need to work through that.
Could you have it as the way it is now, and then have them drop off and then not? I mean, look at your attrition rate and just not
Yes.
keep adding.
Yeah, I think that you could create, yes, to answer your question, if we capped it at some number lower than the current number of licenses, the waiting list would just be a hold until through attrition you got down
Mhm.
and then one finally came available. So that would be probably how we would handle it.
Could we talk just briefly about the transferring of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
license?
Yep. So
Just briefly.
this was an issue, so just to remind the group, last month, the way the packet was put together and the ordinance was put together, short-term rental licenses would not transfer. So in the event that you sold your rental and there was already a waiting list, the rental you just sold would not get that license, but the first person on the waiting list would get the license. This group changed that, and that was something we heard from the real estate community, that was really detrimental to them. So this group agreed to change that to transfer a license. If you had a rental and there's a waiting list and somebody sells that rental, the person who buys the rental gets the license. It doesn't go back to the waiting list. So that's the way it was supposed to be in your packet. I failed to put that in the packet. So that amendment was just put in today, but that's how I understood your recommendation from the last meeting. There is some wordsmithing to do. It's gone because it happened kind of just here recently since the packets went out. City attorney is just refining the language to read better than what I've put together.
So we had a number too for $3,000. A business license may be subject to expiration or may not be renewed should an owner report less than $3,000 of annual revenue.
Yeah.
That was our baseline. I know we had talked about it quickly last week because it was not a significant number. You could almost write a check to yourself for that. Is that something you want to consider raising, given the fact that your normal rentals out here, say in Wild Dunes, is far above $3,000 for 1 week.
Yeah. Is that all you were looking for in transferability? Just to recap, or did you have a?
I
point?
wanted
I'm sorry,
to,
transferability? Is that?
I had asked, and you obliged and sent the Vacation Rental Act out to everyone. And I left mine sitting on my desk. But there is a clause in the Vacation Rental Act that basically, this isn't word for word, please, states that the seller of a property, number one, must give notice of all rentals 90 days out. If you will think in terms of past the closing. The Vacation Rental Act says 90 days past the recording of the deed, the new owner must honor those rentals. My concern is if we don't allow transferability, it is subject to actual damages and court costs for whomever doesn't honor that clause. We may be putting potential future owners into an illegal situation. I do not believe you can pass a regulation that does that. And so I would ask that the attorney kind of look at that Vacation Rental Act, the 90-day clause. And if somebody wants to change the transferability, as been suggested by one of our comments here, that everyone be aware of that statute that's in place.
So as I understand it, the way we have it, where the rental license would transfer, that would be covered, right? We wouldn't be at odds with the state law. Is there any, this was a point, we've had it one way, gone back. Is everybody set? Is everybody okay with leaving it as we've drafted it in the most recent version where the license does transfer? No, okay. So I think we're good there, but I will certainly raise the concern just so everybody's aware if that's something they choose to change or want to consider changing, that they will need to be aware of that.
And on there are a couple of council members that have brought that up.
Right. I've seen some
Why
comments.
can't
Right. In Kiowa, our initial draft followed Kiowa's where they do not allow it to be transferred. When I distributed and made public the packet, the real estate representatives reached out to me and said, hey, didn't you guys say that you were going to do it? And I just forgot. So that's certainly at the forefront of their minds, the real estate professionals. Suzanne, back to your comment. You want to? Yes, the 3,000. So that,
I'm sorry, Sandy, I didn't mean to stop.
No, you're fine.
so the $3,000 question, that also is taken from Kiowa. You know, we've talked internally a lot about how we are creating, and I don't know that there is I think we've come to the conclusion that no matter what you create, there is going to be the ability for abuse and kind of, you know, creating a loophole. Somebody will be able to show that they've rented it. I do think that it would take a certain amount of, you know, work, and, you know, they will have to be aware of it. They'll have to be kind of working towards it. If somebody just lets it, they just don't rent it, and they clearly don't rent it. I mean, I think that it will catch some of those people. It won't catch them, but I mean, that will go back to them and say, hey, you're not renting it, therefore your license is going to be revoked.
I just thought elevating the price would make it, a little more difficult.
Well, I think it's a lot of writing checks to yourself.
It is a lot of
Yeah.
writing checks to yourself.
I think the loophole is that you and your family can write checks to yourself. So I don't know if it matters if it's
Well, to yourself,
20,000.
to yourself and to the accommodations tax and to the retail tax.
That's true.
Yeah.
And
You
so,
gotta pay
It's
taxes
more
on
money
it
for
too.
accommodations tax.
14%.
and I think it's probably going to hurt more the person who's casually renting than
Yeah.
those who are doing it full time, who might be on the beach, who might get 10 grand a week or more. You know, they don't have to go far to cover that, but somebody on the back end of the island who, you know, this is going to be my retirement home, but I only got one person, and you know, I got $1,500, but I took it. You know, they're the ones that you end up hurting by that kind of clause. Even though you can beat the system, not everybody's going to be up on knowing that they needed to beat the system and get tossed out of their
Can
license.
can you rent a place here for $3,000 a week?
I have no idea.
Yes.
Just checking. Because, you know, I go through some of these, you look at houses and it's like, oh, wow, okay. And this is not the winter.
I mean, so when we're going through the list and you see the number of rental licenses for primary residents, and there's quite a few on the
4%.
island, so
Yeah.
they're renting less than, was it 72 days a year?
75.
Some or 75, yeah. So some of those are probably only renting a couple weeks of the year. And that, you know, you don't want to take that away from them.
No, you don't. I agree with that. I mean, it's
But
Yeah,
there
I think this would it really would catch the person, and I keep saying the word catch, it's a bad use, but it would be the person who has no intention of renting it.
Mhm.
They solely got a license to get a license, but they're not marketing it. They've never rented it. They don't have any, it would clear those out from taking up room under this cap, which I think is what it was intended to do. But somebody, wants to do 2 weeks.
And they'll write themselves a check for $3,000, pay the taxes.
It would allow that to happen.
I think it kind of maybe it falls in the bucket we talked about in the other things. I think we should monitor it. I think 3,000 is an okay starting page, but if next year we have, 50% of the renewals at $3,000 in revenue, it may be
Right,
time
right.
to readdress that.
And that would be easy for us because we don't have to collect the data. But
We have
You
to
know,
report your
certainly-
revenue now on your
Yeah.
license.
right,
And we'll have, we do have access to tools that show that they are actively marketing it.
Yeah.
Those tools are identifying whether or not it actually rented ever. So we
Yeah.
will have, somebody never marketed it for rent. It's
Yeah.
something we could monitor. If we're starting to see, okay, this has never been monitored, you're clearly just writing yourself a check and you're not actually renting it, you're just taking up space under this cap. And there's a lot of people who would like to get,
so then my mind goes to a more devious plot. So you're underperforming in your short-term rental license. And by transferring of a license, we are transferring property. And somebody had made a comment about, well, properties don't have licenses, people have licenses.
No.
So,
properties have licenses.
you wouldn't want a property business owner, rental owner to be able to sell his interest. I'm underfunding. I just have this license. But then somebody comes along, oh, I got a 12-bedroom, I want to seat 12, sleep 28 people. I'd be happy to buy your license from you. I just don't want to see that.
Yeah, no,
Instance occur.
it does go with the property.
Yeah.
It does not go, you can't sell it to somebody else. It's tied to the property.
How did, I'm searching, I'm sorry. Where did we have that in this ordinance?
About
Proposal.
the $3,000.
Oh, here it is. Okay,
Top of page
it's on
three.
page 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
I forgot to mention, David, go ahead.
had a couple of thoughts I want to throw out while trying to catch back before when we change subjects. I guess now, considering that we may have to anticipate that we'll be at a cap when we implement this, I had kind of read when I was thinking through that was we had that license holders must renew each year and have until April 30th to renew their license without penalty. Again, it may need to be reworded, but I would take that if you have a license in the cap, that would allow you to go keep your license even if there was a cap in place. That's just kind of the way I read it. I don't know if that was.
And I
the
think
intent
that
behind
is, so if you have a license and you've met the cap, and we would give you the ability to
it,
continue to
your
renew.
license even.
Now,
until-
if
yeah.
somebody were to fall off, they don't renew, they sell, and the new owner doesn't renew, that one would fall off. And I think if we're over the cap, we would have to continue to allow them to
That-
fall off until we finally
till you
get
got to
under
the
the cap. And then the first one that goes under the cap would go to the first person on the waiting
Yes,
list.
and again, I kind of read that. That's how I read that paragraph. I didn't know if that was the intent.
That was
behind it.
that was the intent.
Okay. The other one I was gonna bring up because I think we've talked about it a little bit. Goes back to the June 2010 date in the sand of and again, my kind of thoughts on that were looking through some of this data, there's some houses that were over 12 bedrooms, went off the rental market, and then 2 or 3 years later came back on the rental market, and then were allowed to go to what the original value was. That I just kind of looked at that as I thought it was kind of a loophole that we should close. That once it's off the market, if it comes back on, then it would come back on under the new rules, regardless of when it was built.
That's a curveball.
Sorry.
That's a ninth hour curveball.
I didn't know if anybody else thought of that.
That's like a non-conforming use.
Right, so
Yeah.
if you let your license expire, you're back under the new rules, you don't get grandfathered.
Yeah, we did
Right.
talk about that.
We talked about it a little bit, but again, the way it's worded now is
Right.
because it says 2010. If it had a license in 2010 for 20 people, went off the market and 5 years later or 20 years later, it comes back on the market unless it's been
Now, you're not,
rebuilt.
you're talking independent of the cap,
610
correct?
Ocean Boulevard, 22 people. It goes off the market for
28.
2 years. 28 people, 22. It has 22
Sleeps 28.
rooms.
It's got 11 rooms.
Well,
But who's counting?
It goes off the market.
And then comes back 2
and
years later.
Comes back for a renewal after not having an active license.
Goes back
then
to
it
28.
Should go back to 12, but currently it goes back to 28.
So
is
is
what
that
we had
your, so your
discussed.
point is regardless of the cap, correct?
Yeah, this
Okay.
will also tied back into when we put the cap for 8 in the residential
Right.
areas.
Forgot to mention that. That was
Yeah.
I meant to mention that earlier. So
It kind of tied in with that one too, that if it's currently in those areas, 12 people, becomes a residential home, and then a couple of years later it goes back, it could go back as 12 people. It's, in my opinion, it should fall under whatever current rules are in place.
Didn't we talk about lowering that occupancy, especially in zone 2?
Yeah, that's in here.
So I
6
forgot-
people.
I
That's on
forgot
page
to
3.
mention that
Yeah.
Okay.
If it's torn down, if a house is torn down
It's like
in one of these
glass.
capped areas, rebuilt,
Mhm.
the rebuilt house would be limited to 8 people.
Right.
That's
Regardless
in
if
the,
you have 10, 15,
Right.
20 rooms, right?
but that's kind of a
Remember that.
different, it's a slightly different issue than what David's saying,
Right.
kind of independent of the cap. So in even these uncapped areas, Ocean Boulevard, it goes off, doesn't have a license for 2 years. They come back on, they go back at the occupancy that was in place at 2010 and not, so right now, there's kind of 3 different ways it can be figured. Either you had a license, the house existed and you had a license at 2010. The house existed but didn't have a license in 2010. That's 2 per bedroom plus 2 with no max. And then if you're built new since 2010, the max is 12. It's kind of 3 different categories.
But isn't that
Super simple
reflected,
to keep track of.
isn't that reflected in your license?
Yes,
Your occupant load? So
yes.
do we have to make the reference back to 20?
That was
2010.
my thought, was you'd reference back to the existing license,
license,
allow them to
right.
keep it. So if you have a license that says 20 and you renew it, you're allowed 2 people per bedroom, 2 people per bedroom, or whatever your license currently says. But if that license ever expires, that number becomes 0 for the license, and you're under the
The new rules.
The new rules.
It's new license.
This is barring any fire damage or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Anything that you can
Well-
prove of why you're not.
well, even
Yeah.
if your house burned, you would still have a valid license saying you
Right.
could rent it.
So how much does this happen? How often?
It does,
Yeah.
I mean, a couple
It
times a
does.
year, that a house, a large, kind of what I would call a large capacity rental becomes aged. They want to rebuild it. But they will intentionally remodel the house significantly to keep it from being completely demolished and built brand new. So people are kind of working to maintain those higher occupancies in existing rentals. They're not tearing them down and replacing with a new house. They're remodeling and doing that type of work.
But you're saying they're letting their license expire?
They can, yes. I
In the
mean, they
process.
can, if it takes them 2 years to build. Yeah, we go back to, the code dictates that we go back to the condition of 2010.
Okay, so they're not gonna let their licenses expire anymore if we go with the system. Is basically what we're.
But if it's a 2-year bill.
And
they
I'm not
will
looking
lose-
like the ones that are continuing to rent, and if you remodel and you're still allowed to keep the current occupancy, it's more of the ones that go off the rental market, become residential, and then flip back onto the market as renting to, 13 or more people.
So
So I was just, it was something I was throw out there.
could we,
That's a good point, though.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Uh-huh.
let me just ask this as a favor. That the cap in and of itself, because I think what you're describing is would apply to uncapped areas, would apply.
Right.
Has nothing to do with.
It has nothing to do with
Right.
the cap.
Right.
Could we set that aside for like recommendation 60 days after the cap gets, I guess I get fearful that we are going to have this handoff. We're going to explain all of this.
And that's what they'll,
And there's there's so many kind of facets of this thing to get your head around that. That's another facet that's
Yep.
quite frankly, probably the most complicated part of the whole program.
Yeah.
And we have to wrestle. One goes on the market and they say, how many people can this rent? We have to go back into the 2010 records, figure out what its status was.
So
Can we
don't
hold-
touch section 5.4204, maximum overnight occupancy.
Right.
It is a complicated
yeah.
add-on to an already complicated
Which
issue.
is where the 2010 date line.
Right.
falls.
Right.
Incremental gains.
Incremental gain. It's going to be on the 1-year review.
But yeah, that kind of tied
And
in, I
actually,
guess.
that area, I think that area is Ocean Boulevard and Palm Boulevard. So it would be a very fitting thing to look at when we consider doing the same thing in those areas. But so how does everybody feel about that you okay with that, David?
I am. I kind of, again, I wanted to kind of see what people's opinions are of it. I'm not sure how many houses that's affected. I know there were some that I came across. And again, gets back to if we're trying to move towards conforming to our new ordinances, then we need to have some way to get rid of the ones that don't conform over time, even if it's, 20, 30 years or whatever.
I guess my mind is going. Right now, we're looking back at 2010. We're seeing the condition of 2010. I am guessing that we're going to be adding an additional step of kind of scrutinizing the line of licenses to see if there's ever been a break. But I guess we would get that. I guess we'd be doing that analysis as soon as they renew.
Well, I mean,
So I don't
again,
know that it adds any kind of complexity.
I
But
know there've been some that have changed hands. There's one in particular I can think of on Palm right now that is residential and had been rental, and it had a large number, larger than 12 occupancy. And if they ever sell it, it currently will be allowed to go back with that
that's correct.
large occupancy.
That's correct.
Question.
And I think David's saying it would still be that way unless they let it lapse.
Well, that
It has already lapsed, you're saying.
fairly sure that the one I'm thinking about has
already
and
lapsed.
It's residential or it's a
Yeah.
second home.
Okay.
They don't have a license that I'm aware of. And so at some point, any day in the future, they can come back and rent 18 people or whatever the number
Right.
was. And I'm kind of with David. I think that's a door we could close very easily without a lot of difficulty. But we can wait.
You want to,
You want to wait? I don't-
I-
Because I also question how it relates to the wording you put in paragraph C, which has a similar type problem. Because we're talking about in zones 1, 2, and 3, limiting to 8. But you
New
only use the
constructed.
word only for new construction.
right.
Why shouldn't it apply to somebody who's never had a license either?
New permits.
A new license
Yeah, I
or new
thought that's what we
construction.
had done was a new permit. Any new
Right, not new
Oh,
construction.
regardless,
rental
Right,
licenses applied for in area 1, 2, and 3, I thought were now going to be limited to an occupancy of 8.
Not just new construction.
not new
Correct.
construction,
Yeah.
existing big house comes
Any-
In
in.
addition to new construction, I mean, it was just,
Well, it's
Yeah,
any,
well, I may have
anyone
missed that.
applying for
Any
a
new
new
permit.
license on
Yeah,
a
license,
currently
yeah.
unlicensed property after 2022 would be limited to 8 was what I thought we were doing with our cap.
Would that muddy the
So not
waters?
permitted for the maximum occupancy of a residence with a license issued after this date
Well, I think that goes
Eight.
back
So you
into,
grandfather everything that's out
that
there.
has a
Right.
license
But
right
after
now.
this point, all new licenses are limited to 8.
Or new
I really
license,
thought
new
that's what
construction.
we were
Exactly
doing.
right. That's,
So actually constructed or licensed.
Right. I would
Any
just,
new license.
any new license, you don't need construction,
But if it's an old house, has a license, they maintain the license, built
but
a
they
new
maintain
house.
it fine.
So I buy your house and it.
But it's
I
maintained, it's
see.
not a new
12,
license,
Yeah.
like they're maintaining their license while they're renovating or
But
doing.
what if
But if
they're
they're
adding-
at 14 and they build a
bedrooms
new
or-
house, we want that to go back to 8.
Yes.
yes,
So constructed or issued a new license.
Mm-hmm.
Either one.
that's right.
Right.
And I use the word unlicensed, so any existing license gets to carry forward.
Right.
Right.
And because it's transferable, it's going to be to a new owner.
Right.
So it's basically unlicensed new applicants.
So the 3-bedroom house that gets renovated and maybe somebody adds a couple more bedrooms, is still gonna have an
Limited.
8-person,
Limited to 8
Limitation.
unless it has a current.
which it was
ongoing-
before.
Mhm.
So, they're doing it altruistically, for their own sake. But no, it's, I think that's a benefit. I mean, I think
A room
the
for
renovations
everybody.
I've been doing back there.
Honey,
have
you can
not been
sleep in the
put
room
on.
over there. I'll
Right.
sleep in this room over here.
We'll see
We
where
get our
the
own
word
rooms
says.
now.
You think that's doable? Get that in?
Do you guys want David's request or Sandy's request? Which one are you asking, Marty?
I thought they were the same.
Well, neither of
Yeah.
them have to do with,
Well,
I'm looking for your opinion. What do you think's gonna be received?
neither of them have to do with the cap.
No,
That's just
Sandy's does.
occupancy.
Sandy's is
Zone
the
1, 2, and
8,
3.
is the 8, talking about the 8 in the capped areas.
Right.
Right.
That's.
David's doesn't. If
So
you
Sandy's
guys,
numbers,
Yes,
yeah.
I think we all
Okay, yeah.
want Sandy's, right?
yeah,
That's what we thought we were signing up for.
Yeah.
Right.
I thought we had.
Yeah, but we're, now yours
So,
applies
David,
Is the-
everywhere else,
is the
not
group-
outside the cap.
is there consensus that, as David described it, any new, regardless of whether there's a cap or not, if a property lets its license lapse, comes back and it's in an uncapped area, that one would go to 12, regardless of size.
Mhm.
Down for it. We
All
were
right.
gonna wait to talk about that.
But-
Yeah, I was
but
gonna say,
We'll-
I don't
we'll
know.
put it- I'll-
I don't think
Lawyers
that
are
would-
working on it. I'll have them,
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
basically that one paragraph, you're changing new construction to new license, I guess is.
Yeah.
yeah. So it would be the same
then-
wording as what we just did, new
Yeah.
construction or new license after, and then the June 22-10 date will be changed to the ratification of this code's date.
No, I wouldn't put a date. I would just say you need a new license. So if it's not a renewal, if it's a renewal, you're allowed to, you may want to add that into the maximum number as the previous license.
I
So-
think they'll
so
want,
where-
I think they'll want a new date in there. Because
Yeah, 'cause
otherwise,
it has to be as of
as of,
2022, all
Because you're grandfathered.
unlicensed applicants in zone 1, 2, and 3 are limited to 8.
you are drawing the line in that date.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, go for it.
I,
Mhm.
Go for it, Sandy.
after, I don't know how you delete the 2010 and address that for, it's a new license now. Any properties that were grandfathered under the 2010 date line and are applying, have not contiguously been licensed, revert back to the zoning of 12, occupancy of 12.
So I was, when I was kind of writing notes to myself of how to, I wasn't real sure how to implement this either, but that first paragraph, A, the maximum overnight occupancy of an existing residence for which the owner is holding a valid business license shall be limited to the greater of the 2 persons per bedroom plus 2 I think you could actually omit the next set one, 6 people for the number of their current license. So anybody renewing a license would have whatever, that would be one of those 3 numbers that they could say, you know, I have.
Well,
6,
so their
2 per
their
bedroom
current
or-
license, if it's an old that is the A is the original wording prior to 2010.
Right,
So that's how they calculated,
right.
that's how they calculated their occupancy in 2010.
Which would be their occupancy today on any current license.
I don't know why you would do that. I mean, right now we're spelling out how you got there. Otherwise,
Yeah.
we're saying, I think Douglas just wrote down a.
So the
superfluous
Wrote it
maximum-
down wrong. Okay, I can see that point.
So A, the maximum overnight occupancy of an existing residence for which the owner is holding a valid license on June 22nd, 2010 shall be limited to the greater of whatever they're grandfathered in at. Until such time as the license lapses, which will revert to 12.
Yeah, I think
Something like that is
12
what
if you're
we're
in an
saying.
uncapped area.
Mhm.
Correct. You have to have the uncapped area.
Because if you're in a capped area, it goes to 8.
Help me with the 6 people. How
Everybody
does
in
that
agreement?
fit in? Yes.
We're gonna try to,
I'll
I'm gonna
look at that
try
too.
to get the lawyers to put that in
So
as cleanly as they can.
your
You
one
got-
bedroom C cabin that has the bunk in the hallway, you could actually put 6 people in there. As a minimum.
The maximum overnight occupancy of an existing residence for which the owner is holding a valid license or may be limited to the greater of.
It's a small
Right.
floor space. There's one
If you got like a
bedroom, but you can
400
stack people in the hallway.
400 square foot condo, 1 bedroom.
Just that.
We're telling you, you could still rent to 6. And I don't know if it's C cabins,
It's the
whatever the one
greater
is.
of, so, yeah.
Yeah, the greater of. So that's saying,
You
the
know,
least will-
One rooms over here.
oh, yeah, that's what, that's what I'm talking about. But they also have, don't they have the bunks in the
They have
hallway?
bunks and they have pullouts.
Yeah,
Okay,
That's right.
all right.
so that's your 6.
Sardines.
TV show about, I can say that. You're completely confused now, Douglas.
Never. No, I think that's,
Might not be right, but I'm never in doubt.
I won't ask any more
So,
questions.
so,
no, David, I can take it.
Very good.
so that would lead us over to maximum occupancy at any time.
Yep.
Overnight.
Oh, at any time.
And so that
It's
goes to the
54205.
daytime.
Yeah.
And that was, is that?
That's pretty much brand new. That was 2020. That was 1 year ago change. That is the last change in this. You have a question about it or?
I just think 40 is a lot. I
Well,
mean,
so it's 40 or
20.
twice that, so it was prior to last year's change, it was 40 regardless of the size.
Right.
And then they added the city, we added, or twice the daytime occupancy. So if you're in the C
Nighttime.
cabin, I'm sorry, the nighttime. So if you're in the C cabin that has 6, you double that to get 12. So the maximum prior to this change was 40 in a C cabins. Now, after this change, it's 12 in a C cabin.
So
if I have-
610 Ocean has 20, sleeps 28.
So they,
They could have 40.
They're limited to 40.
So if I have a license for 8 and I have my 20-person family over Thanksgiving, I'm over the limit.
You are overnight.
And that's why
You are
there's
They can't
always,
stay.
always been a lot of hesitance about.
At any time, doesn't stay overnight.
Yes.
that's correct.
that's
If you're
daytime.
8,
Okay, it
the
is.
most you could have at any time is 16.
Okay.
It used to be 40. It was reduced to 16. You want to go back to 40?
I'm not, no, we gotta pick our battles. That was, I'm just, again,
that one, I
saying,
mean, I'll
have
say-
more than
I read
16
that
people
wrong,
for
so-
Thanksgiving, so.
I read that wrong.
That was
But you'll
really,
get to meet Chief Cornett.
And your reference points wrong. 54204.
Oh,
That was just because you were writing it out.
oh, did I say?
Determined by
205.
section 54203. I'm
It's
sorry.
the old 203, new 205.
Is that it?
Yeah, it's being changed in our draft
Okay,
to
so
205.
that's why I was looking, I went back to 203 and I'm like,
Yeah, it's the old 203. Will in the future be 205. All right, who's ready to recap?
We're good. No more comments. We don't need to change everything. We're good.
I'm done.
For the benefit of
listen to.
our anticipated meeting with council, we are gonna point out a one-year review and potentially, and focus on the potential for capping residential areas that are currently uncapped. Is that, we agreeing on that? We are going to change this draft for their consideration. That would say, if you have an active license and it's above the limits and you let it lapse, are we going to say so a non-conforming use is a year lapse, to not catch the like guy who's 3 days late?
I was just sitting there thinking that I think you need to have a year of unlicensure.
Right.
Because there are circumstances with family deaths, things. that
Where they
happen.
miss a renewal date.
Yeah,
So if you go for more than a year without it licensed, you will go back to
The
your
no longer
number or
grandfathered.
12.
current cap of 12.
So,
That puts it on an owner's shoulders. You better
Well,
keep up with your license.
well, that's right. And if you lapse and it's capped out, you might have to wait a year or two.
if you're in a capped area. Yeah,
Capped
that's
area,
correct. And in that situation, you actually go back to 8, not 12.
Mhm, right.
So that's also a change. I had it as newly constructed, but it's newly constructed or
Anything in the
lapsed.
neighborhood.
Anything that I missed that we discussed?
So with the workshop, Douglas, on the data we went through an awful lot. I'm not proposing we bring any of that forward. But there were some key elements that I think are important and I don't know what you're proposing to bring forward in terms of that data, but there has been a decline over the years, a subtle shift in the number of vacation rental licenses. And there has been the number of new construction that have been licensed is not an egregious number either. I think at one point it
That's
was
correct.
2 of the 50 building permits sought a vacation rental license. I think some of those statistics helped us make some of the decisions we made. And I don't know what else you all find pertinent, but I would ask that those 2 data sets kind of.
So those have been provided to them already. But I would anticipate in this workshop, we would give, I would give kind of a 5-10 minute overview of what you all did, the data you collected. And I think there's some very key points in there that we would include in that initial kind of introduction to give to the council. So I would give an introduction to that. I would then go into an explanation of how this recommendation would work. And then so probably 10-15 minutes and then open it up for conversation, questions. I'm sure they're going to have a lot of questions and we'll just sit around the table and talk it out. But that's how I envisioned it going at the workshop.
I assume it's an open public meeting.
Yeah.
Um,
It's right. It'll be right before their Ways and Means meeting. So they'll be together already. So yeah, it'll be
Gotcha.
public and in this room. All right, if nobody has anything else, only thing remaining is to make a recommendation.
Do we need to summarize everything?
You'll send a draft of
Send a
what
draft.
we just drafted.
Yes.
I will, yep, and I think it's as submitted or as discussed and just amended to include. We really just included some of it is activity that we will take on ourselves, but for the ordinance itself, it's the inclusion of bringing lapse licenses into the new minimums.
204.
But we all have consensus, so we don't need to kind of vote on it.
Yeah, I do think it's a recommendation. So you need to make a recommendation, which is. a
Tonight.
vote. I would, yeah, I mean, I think you all going forward.
Yep.
Would be from a recommendation from this
So
group.
who wants to put that forward as a motion? So-
As our president?
Okay.
As presented and
Thanks, because
amended.
we talked about a lot of things. So, yeah, I would make a motion that we recommend to city council the impending cap ordinance that we've discussed this evening as amended.
Second.
Any further discussion, clarification? So all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
And I'll try to circle back with the recommendation. So you will see it before it goes out, and then hopefully this week. So just take a look at it before I send it off to be sure that we get the wording correct. So while we're on the issue of the workshop, does that date, that tentative date, 6/21 at 3:30, does that work for most of you, all of you? Anybody have a problem? Good.
Now, I had also had put something down. Maybe that was when we were just talking about Monday, the 13th. So this is in lieu of.
That's correct.
Okay.
So Monday the 13th is off.
Glad you said that.
Do I need to,
No, we could.
did I circulate that? Do I need to take that back? What was the date?
Monday.
The 13th.
June
So we had
13th.
talked about it. We were toying with that.
No worries.
Availabilities of the room and court and
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff.
21st.
Tuesday, 21st at 3:30.
That's where it's.
Suzanne, did that one go at 6:30 in your calendar?
You
Just
know,
out of
it wouldn't let me select it. It's just still sitting there. It doesn't swoosh away or anything.
Huh.
It just sits there.
Peculiar stuff.
I think we've identified the problem.
What?
Operator error.
I told you it's 99%, but
Share the keyboard interface.
let's see where it go. I never had an issue until I used iop.net email. Just say it.
Oh,
What time, what was the time? Sorry.
3:30. This room, 21st.
Should we go
I
on?
wrote it in my real calendar. So
It's locked in. All right.
We move on to old business, discussion of the transportation element,
So
all the same.
it's all the same.
Let's move on.
Now that this is- Now that short-term rental caps is
Yeah.
off the table, we're going to move quickly on
Okay.
Yeah.
transportation. I promise.
So missed that.
We're getting back to it.
So the code of conduct. Sorry.
So it's in your packet, you have a code of conduct. This was worked on and adopted by city council. And I'm just, there is no implication that anybody here ever doesn't conduct themselves according to a proper code of conduct. But kind of at the last minute, they made their own code apply to appointed officials, boards and commissions, including the planning commission. So it's in your packet. I think that everybody on this commission has always acted in accordance with that code of conduct. But it's there for your information. If you have any questions, be happy to answer those. But I think it's,
Looking like they want a signature and date too.
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
They could have blood.
Have all the
I have no
blood.
blood.
Let's bring
Well,
back
look
the
at-
Christmas party.
Go.
Look it over and yeah, if you have questions, let me know. You just got it. So may not have had a chance to look it over, but we'll circle back on it. Get a signature someday in the future.
Hey, so going back up, sorry, I'm out of order here, but with the transportation element. So
Yes.
next time when we are ready to discuss it, are we gonna have a clean version to look
Yeah.
at?
Yes, a red line. We'll have a red line.
It's been some space and time, things start to
Yeah.
get fuzzy.
They do. Yeah, we will have a new version to look at. Matt doesn't know yet. But it's gonna be hard.
Oh, that'll be under his tenure, right?
That's right.
So real quick, we had a presentation and we talked about traffic. And I believe the city has engaged an engineering firm to study, evaluate, and
That's correct.
they're studying and evaluating.
They are, yep, two kind of key and two different phases. One is the connector specifically. And I think Desiree's gone, but they have identified, I don't know if you're in on those meetings, but maybe 6, 7 alternatives to
Well,
kind of
They're
analyze.
supposed to, the SCDOT is supposed to give the city sometime in the fall, they say 8
8.
alternative configurations to the connector, at which time either city council as a whole or some break off of city council will take those 8, narrow it down to 3 viable, feasible options, and then present those to the public for public comment. That's the last plan I heard.
So that's on the connector specifically, and then, and I guess as a follow-on to that project, there will be a second phase that would go all the way, kind of a corridor study all the way up to Highway 17. And I do know they've been having meetings with the DOT, Town of Mount Pleasant officials on the matter. So there's definitely focused work on the Isle of Palms connector going on now. And we talked a little bit about this, that we're going to be submitting that work is ongoing. We're working on a plan that'll probably all be kind of hitting at the same time. So we may have to adjust for that in our process along the way.
So do you reckon that they'll engage us for what they're doing, just to meet in the middle and make sure that it can obviously conforms, but fits within what we're doing?
I think it would probably potentially go the other way around.
Yeah.
That the comp plan would be, if something comes out of that, that's that the comp plan would get adjusted. I think. Marty doesn't like that. I think that's, there's been some, it's a very touchy issue, for lack of a better term. It's, so yeah.
You can go back and read all of it, essentially. These details and minutes of the public safety, because that's where most of that stuff is.
Gotcha. There's a lot of cooks on that.
Well, let's assume we'll just converge in our.
Perfect,
Process.
seamlessly.
Mhm.
That's all government.
That'd be nice.
Over time.
Yeah.
There's a time factor.
Yeah.
All of it. So,
Marty, I will though, as things come out on that, I will loop planning commission in just on what's happening as things become available.
We are done with Stan Tech. They
That's
made their
correct.
presentation and we're going to take some of that.
That's
and
correct. You will
somebody,
identify-
Matt, is gonna redline that into the comprehensive.
Yeah, you will
plan.
kind of
Correct.
prioritize some of that and it'll be incorporated into the comprehensive plan element.
And my mind has changed now that my family has really gotten to the idea of the gondola.
The gondola that's moved up is
That'll be in
priority.
appendix A.
That's right.
That'll all
Gondola's
be in
moving.
appendix A.
And I didn't even tell them about the gondolas. They came up with it on their own. So there you have it, triangulation.
Very good. You get 6 overnight guests to the top.
I think
I
that's it.
think that's everything, isn't it?
That's it for me, unless there's anything else.
Have a motion to adjourn
Motion to adjourn.
Well, that's
Second.
quick.
and a second. And all in favor?
I
Anybody dare say no?
know, right? Dare you.
There.
All right, that's a big chunk of work. Amy, we all.